In 1997, Apple was about 90 days away from being insolvent. That's not a critic's number, by the way. That's the number used by the man they brought in to save it, the same man the company had thrown out 12 years earlier. What happened over the next 14 years is the most famous comeback in business history. You know the products, you're probably carrying one of them right now. I know I am. So today we're talking about how Steve Jobs actually saved Apple and about the parts of the story that never make the keynote. A stock scandal, a secret wage deal, and a series of decisions about his own body that doctors still argue about. September 1997, Steve Jobs takes over as interim CEO of a company that just lost over $1 billion in a single fiscal year. His salary is $1. Keep that in mind because we're going to come back to it. The general consensus in the industry that Apple was finished. A month after Jobs took over, Michael Dell, founder of Dell Computer, was asked on stage what he would do with Apple, and his answer was, "I'd shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders." Everyone forgets the first thing Jobs actually did. He didn't build anything, he killed things. Apple was making dozens of products, multiple confusing computer lines, printers, a handheld called the Newton, and licensing deals that let clone makers sell Mac knockoffs cheaper than Apple could. Jobs walked through all of that with a machete. He killed the Newton, he killed the clones, he cut around 70% of the products in development, cut thousands of jobs along the way, and drew a 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. Consumer and pro, desktop and portable. 4 quadrants. Apple would make one great product in each box and nothing else. The comeback did not start with an invention, it started with a subtraction. Most companies in trouble add things to look busy. Jobs understood that focus means saying no to things that are pretty good. In August of 1997, a month before the board made him interim CEO at a Mac convention in Boston, Jobs did the thing his own fans hated most. He announced a deal with Microsoft. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen behind him, looming over the stage like a villain, and the crowd booed. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple, commit to making Office for the Mac for 5 years, and the two companies would settle their long-running patent fight. Jobs stood in front of a booing crowd and said the quiet part out loud. We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. Now, quick myth check, because this event created one of the most repeated wrong facts in tech history. You've heard that Microsoft saved Apple with that investment. It's a great story. Bitter rivals, mercy money. The villain saves the hero, but it's not really true. $150 million was not the difference between life and death for a company Apple's size. The money was closer to a rounding error. What mattered was everything around the money. The guaranteeing that Office would stay on the Mac, which kept business customers from fleeing, the end of the lawsuit, and most of all, the signal to customers and developers and the press that Apple was not about to disappear. What actually saved Apple was the product call and what came next. Then, 12 days after the board finally gave him the CEO title, Jobs put out the campaign that told everyone what the comeback was going to be. Apple didn't have a hit product yet. The iMac was still months away. The first thing Jobs shipped wasn't a computer, it was an idea about identity. He went back to Chat Day, the ad agency behind the famous 1984 commercial, and they built a 1-minute black and white television spot with no product in it at all. No specs, no price, just footage of Einstein, of Bob Dylan, of Martin Luther King, John Lennon, Muhammad Ali, Mahatma Gandhi, Picasso, and a bunch of others, and a voice reading a kind of manifesto. Here's to the crazy ones.
Here's to the crazy ones.
The misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers. It was called Think Different, and it ran for the first time in September of 1997 while the company was still bleeding. Jobs said the campaign was there to remind people what Apple stood for, and if you read between the lines, to remind Apple itself. And on a personal note, that campaign had a big impact on me and at my businesses. In my company, Legit, our slogan is Think Big, and that was partly inspired by the Think Different campaign, because we, like Apple, want to make a difference, and we think that the way that we can do that is by helping people think beyond what they've already thought. So moving on, there is a detail about that ad that most people don't know, and I'm saving it for the end of this video, so remember the ad because we're going to come back to it. Now, in 1998, Apple released the iMac, a translucent blue, friendly-looking computer that designed by a young Englishman named Johnny Ive, who was about to become the most influential industrial designer alive. It became the fastest-selling Mac in the company's history to that point, and 1 year after losing $1 billion, Apple posted a profit of about $300 million. The patient was off the table, and the run started. What followed was the most relentless product run any company has ever put together. And the interesting part isn't in the keynotes, it's the decisions. 2001, the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Great product, but the move that turned it into an empire came 2 years later. The iPod only worked with a Mac, and Macs were maybe 3% of the computers on Earth. Jobs' own team spent months pushing him to open it up to Windows, and he fought them the whole way because opening up meant helping the enemy. He finally gave in. iTunes hit Windows in 2003, the same year the iTunes Store took the chaos of music piracy and turned it into a business, and the iPod went from a Mac accessory to the default music player for the entire planet. Apple went on to sell hundreds of millions of them. Then, in 2007 came the iPhone. At the time, the iPod was about 40% of Apple's revenue, and the iPhone was designed to eat it. Jobs did it anyway on a logic he was blunt about. If Apple didn't build the thing that killed the iPod, somebody else would. Within a decade, the iPhone became the most profitable single product in the history of products. Then, 2008, the App Store. Maybe the biggest business decision of the whole run, and the one Jobs initially got wrong. When the iPhone launched, he didn't want outside developers on it at all. He wanted control. No, really, Steve Jobs wanted control. His own team and a chorus of developers spent a year pushing him. He finally relented, and the App Store opened in 2008. Developers piled in, and Apple took 30% of every dollar that moved through it. The greatest product visionary of his era had to be talked into it. Then in 2010 came the iPad, and in August of 2011, for a moment, Apple passed Exxon to become the most valuable company on Earth. The company that was 90 days from insolvent 14 years earlier. Now, one more thing about this stretch. When Jobs took over in 97, he set his salary at $1 a year, and that dollar got used as a halo. His wealth was in stock. Apple stock plus the Pixar stake that became a massive block of Disney stock when Disney bought Pixar for $7.4 billion in 2006 and made him Disney's largest individual shareholder. And in 2001, the Apple board literally gave him a private jet, a Gulfstream 5, worth about $90 million. The dollar salary was real, it just wasn't the whole picture. And that's where the story usually ends. Genius returns, genius wins, roll the montage. That's not how we do things here. There's a lot more to this man's story. At the absolute peak of the comeback, Steve Jobs' name ended up at the center of a federal securities investigation, and almost nobody remembers it. In 2001, Apple's board granted Jobs 7.5 million stock options. The paper trail said the grant was approved at a special board meeting in October. Investigators later concluded that meeting never took place. The minutes had been fabricated, and the date on the grant had been picked after the fact. backdated to a day when the stock price was lower, which made the options instantly more valuable. Do that without disclosing it, and it's securities fraud. This was a part of a wave, by the way. In the mid-2000s, regulators caught dozens of company backdating options, and Apple's internal investigation found problems with thousands of its own grants. But two mattered most: 4.8 million options to the executive team and 7.5 million to Jobs. The federal government charged two people: Apple's former general counsel, Nancy Hyman, who the SEC said backdated the grants and papered the meeting that never happened, and Apple's former chief financial officer, Fred Anderson. Anderson settled for about $3.5 million. Hyman went for about $2.2 million. The backdating caused Apple to underreport roughly $40 million in expenses, and about half of that traced to the Jobs grant. So what about Jobs? Precision matters on this one because he was never charged. Apple's internal investigation and the SEC concluded he was aware that favorable dates had been picked, but he hadn't understood the accounting consequences and hadn't financially benefited, partly because those options were later canceled. Two things sit uncomfortably next to that clean conclusion, though. The investigation that cleared him was run by Apple's own board, and Fred Anderson, on his way out the door, had his lawyer release a public statement saying he had personally warned Jobs about the accounting implications of the grant. His general counsel and his chief financial officer paid millions and left. The CEO the grant was for was cleared by his own company, and the government agreed. That's the record, and you can decide for yourself what you believe. And the stock options weren't the only place his fingerprints showed up in a courtroom. Through the mid-2000s, the biggest names in tech quietly agreed not to recruit each other's people. No cold calls. Which sounds polite until you realize that recruiting is how salaries go up. When Google poached Apple's engineers, Jobs went straight to Google's leadership, and it stopped. Google's own CEO later testified that Steve's unhappiness absolutely influenced the change. After his death, a federal judge certified a class action for roughly 64,000 tech workers and called Jobs a central figure in the whole arrangement. The man who told graduates to never settle spent years making sure his engineers couldn't shop around. The third story played out in 2010 at the factories where Apple products get made. Apple, like most of the industry, built its hardware through giant contract manufacturers in China, and the biggest was called Foxconn. In 2010, a cluster of worker suicides at Foxconn's massive Shenzhen complex became a global news story, and Apple, as Foxconn's most famous customer, became the face of the questions. Jobs answered the questions himself on stage at a tech conference that summer. His words: Foxconn is not a sweatshop.
Foxconn is not a sweatshop. I mean, you go to this place and it's a factory, but my gosh, I mean, they've got restaurants and movie theaters and hospitals and swimming pools, and I mean, it's a for a factory, it's a pretty nice factory.
He pointed to the restaurants and movie theaters and pools on the campus. And in an email to a customer, he wrote that while every suicide is tragic, Foxconn's suicide rate was well below the China average, and that Apple all over this. Was that true? The statistics were arguably right, but the answer still landed wrong because below average for a country is a strange defense of a workplace. Apple did expand its supplier audits, and Foxconn raised wages and added safety measures. And the deeper issue that the entire modern electronics industry runs on this labor model did not change, and unfortunately, it still hasn't. One more item here, and I'll keep it short and factual. When Jobs came back in '97, he shut down Apple's corporate philanthropy programs at a moment when the company was dying, which was defensible. They didn't come back when he ran the company. When he died, the New York Times noted that there was no public record of personal charitable giving, and he never signed the pledge most billionaires of his era signed. His wife has said since that they gave anonymously, and Apple under Jobs as a major backer of the Red campaign against AIDS. So the honest statement is narrow. The public record of his giving is thin. What happened privately, we don't know. Right in the middle of this stretch, in June of 2005, comes the 15 minutes that might outlive everything else he made. Stanford asked Jobs to give its commencement address. He had never given one before. No product to launch, no stage he controlled, just a stadium full of graduates. And he stood up and told 3 plain stories from his own life. Dropping out of college and wandering into a calligraphy class, getting fired from Apple, his words, and how it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him. And then a third story the audience didn't know the weight of. A year earlier, he told them he had been diagnosed with cancer. And he stood there and talked about what facing death does to a person.
I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months.
Death, he said, is very likely the single best invention of life. He closed with 4 words borrowed from the back cover of an old counterculture catalog he loved growing up.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
It became the most watched commencement speech ever delivered, and almost nobody in that stadium knew the cancer story wasn't finished. So let's go back to October of 2003, where Jobs had a CT scan. He was getting scanned for a kidney issue when doctors spotted something on his pancreas. The words pancreatic cancer are usually a death sentence, and that's what everyone around him feared. But the biopsy brought shocking news in the good direction. It was a rare form, a neuroendocrine tumor, slow-growing, treatable. By his own telling, when the doctors looked at the cells, they cried with relief. This was a cancer he could beat, and the recommendation was surgery. And Jobs said no. For roughly 9 months, one of the most powerful men in the world, with access to any doctor on the planet, treated his cancer with special diets, acupuncture, herbal remedies, and treatments he found online, while the tumor sat inside him and the people closest to him begged him to have the operation. In July of 2004, he finally did. And during the surgery, the doctors found the cancer had spread to his liver. Would 9 months have made the difference? Look, that's still debated. And I'm not going to pretend it's settled or like I have anything intelligent to offer. Some doctors have said publicly that the delay likely cost him his best chance. Others point out that slow tumors like this one are sometimes watched for a while, even under standard care. Nobody can rerun it. What we know is what he thought. He later told his biographer, Walter Isaacson, that he regretted the delay. And when his biographer asked why a man this rational refused surgery, the answer was that he didn't want his body to be opened. He didn't want to be violated in that way. His words, as he told them to his biographer, the reality distortion field built the Macintosh, saved Apple, and sold the world a phone with no keyboard, and then he pointed it at a tumor. The greatest strength this man had, and the flaw that may have killed him, were the exact same trait. The cancer came back, publicly, in his appearance before it was ever in a press release. Through 2008, he grew visibly thinner on stage, and in January of 2009, he stepped away on medical leave. That spring, he received a liver transplant at a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, why Tennessee for a man who lived in California? Because transplant waiting lists are regional. The wait in Tennessee was far shorter, and the rules allow a patient to register in multiple regions if they can get there fast enough, which, if you own a Gulfstream, you can. It was completely legal, and it was also publicly debated by medical ethicists because it's a legal advantage that only exists if you're rich, and Jobs became the most famous example of it. He came back to work, he introduced the iPad, but he kept declining. On August 24th, 2011, he resigned as CEO with a short letter that began, I have always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come. Tim Cook took over, and 6 weeks later, on October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs died at home surrounded by his family. He was 56. So let's look at this whole thing. Strip away the montage, and the arc is simple. A dying company handed itself back to the founder it had thrown out, and he turned it into the most valuable company on earth. And the same 14 years that hold the greatest comeback in business history also hold the scandals, the settlements, and a tumor he tried to beat with a diet. That's not a contradiction. That's the actual point of this whole story. It's one man. The refusal to accept reality as delivered is the entire engine. It shipped with the Macintosh, and it argued with the biopsy. You don't get to order the parts separately. Apple didn't, his family didn't, he didn't. He bent reality his entire life, and reality only had to win once. He told those Stanford graduates the truest thing he knew. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. 6 years later, his time ran out at 56, with the most valuable company on earth and a list of reckonings attached to his names. Both of those are the real story. The highlight reel gives you the turtleneck and the keynote. The real story is the whole man, and the whole man is a lot more interesting. So one last thing. That Think Different ad from 1997, the one with no product in it, the version the world heard was narrated by the actor Richard Dreyfuss.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the trouble.
But there's another version. Jobs recorded the whole thing in his own voice, listened to it, and refused to run it. He said if they used his voice, people would make the ad about him. It stayed in a drawer for 14 years until he died. And at the memorial Apple held on the campus lawn 2 weeks later, that's the version they played. Steve Jobs' own voice reading the manifesto his comeback was built on at his own memorial. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the ones who see things differently. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently.